Consultant with Microsoft, and so I'm out there in the field. I'm working directly with our customers, and I imagine I go through a lot of the same pains that you folks do at your customers. How many folks in here are SI? System integrator? Anybody else just in an IT shop trying to do this at their company? All right, perfect. So I work day to day with folks like you trying to figure out how you scale out these SharePoint 2010 environments. And let me just say, I know it's past beer 30, so I really appreciate you taking some time out of your day right here to be here. It's past 5, so thank you very much. So basic session flow. We are going to walk through, we're going to start off with something that was actually presented at SharePoint conference, the last one. And we're going to get an overview of the scalability points within SharePoint. And this is really important because when you talk about scaling out a massive document management system in SharePoint, it's really about how do you get value out of that content as your content grows up through the different life cycles. So we're going to review the front-end scale improvements in SharePoint 2010. And then we're going to take a look at some of the back-end scale improvements. We're just going to cover over those for a minute. And then we're going to jump into SharePoint 2010 architecture and what that would look like for scaling out a SharePoint farm with terabytes of data. And from there, we'll move in and we'll look at some of the supporting technologies that may or may not be essential. So for instance, RBS, FAST, and then we'll also look at some of the considerations you should think about when scaling out your farms. In any case, when you leave here, you should recognize that it takes a village to build this out. I mean, we're going to cover a lot of different topics. We're going to talk about storage. We're going to talk about SharePoint architecture. We're going to talk about FAST. And so you're going to need SMEs from each of those areas, right? So you're going to need engage with a storage and geometry SME. You're going to need to engage with an information architect. You're going to need to engage with a SharePoint SME. So it's definitely going to take a lot of different skill sets when scaling out your SharePoint 2010 farms. And so what are the scale points in SharePoint? So at the very top, what we're looking at are just team sites. So how many folks in here turn on self-service site creation in their SharePoint farms? Right? So that's the first scale point, right? That's where the inception happens. From there, you get into a more managed library where you may have more metadata around your content, your documents. But it's still probably to a specific department or something like that. And beyond that, we start looking at less instances, and we look in more towards archiving scenarios. And in these archiving scenarios, we're looking at millions of documents in a library that are probably being fed from multiple sources across your organization. And this is really what we want to focus on today. After we go through and get an overview of these scale points, we're going to focus on that massive architecture in the second part of this. So again, you can see you've got a lot more team sites, but they're smaller. And as you start getting towards these archives, you have left sites with many more items. And the kind of glue that keeps all that together in SharePoint 2010 is your enterprise managed metadata service and content type syndication. And so the first thing we'll talk about is an ad hoc team library. And you've got these out, you've got self-service site creation turned on. But one of the key things you want to remember as these are being spun up is that it's really important that you're still leveraging your taxonomy, right? You're leveraging managed metadata service. People are actively tagging their documents because ultimately these documents will end up in your archives. And if records or legal, if anybody ever wants to get some value out of those archives, it's got to have some level of metadata applied to it. So I'll ask this, how many people in here would say that they actively have a corporate taxonomy defined for their company? So I see a few hands. Not half of you, maybe less than a quarter. And so one of the big things I'm seeing with customers is starting to spin up these corporate taxonomies and feeding those into the managed metadata service to really apply this metadata across their content. So I just want to hammer home the point that it's really important to have that metadata starting with the inception of the content. As we move into a managed library, so this may, maybe it's RFPs or something along those lines, you'll start seeing more and more documents within these libraries. You'll have a little more structure. Maybe you have content types. You may have some informal site collection owner managing the metadata on these. But the thing to understand here is that there's tools at your disposal. Again, the managed metadata service, content query web parts. And we'll see as we move up through the scale points, it's really important that each of these tool sets and features build on top of one another. So it's not as if you just use this set of tools or use that set of tools. They all kind of build on top of each other. So as you go through the document lifecycle and you're looking at scale, it's important that you're leveraging all these tools throughout that lifecycle. From there, we kind of, we're looking at content that's maybe a little more formal, and now we're looking at a repository. So does anyone know how many items you can store in a SharePoint 2010 library, a single repository? Anybody know? Is it 2,000? Is it 5,000? It's millions, right? So, okay, so I mean, in 2007, has anybody read Steve Peshka's white paper on scaling document libraries, large lists, right? So you get, into 5 million items. Well, in SharePoint 2010, we've got this list throttling on the back end, right? So we can load millions and millions of documents into these repositories. And within these repositories, a lot of times what you're doing is you're relying on the metadata that's applied to the content to really derive value from it. And you do that through managed metadata navigation, so or just metadata navigation. So has anyone in here leveraged the metadata navigation feature? So that's what you'll be using a lot of times in these repositories, is that metadata navigation. And so you could have 10 million items, but if you've got the proper metadata applied, you've got a taxonomy in place, you'll be able to quickly find that needle in the haystack. Again, you'll be using things like the content organizer, which has content rules to help you kind of manage the data that's coming in and organize it appropriately. And so we talked about team sites where you've got lots of team sites, maybe a small number of documents. Then you've got a more formal library with maybe some more documents, tens of thousands of documents. And then we talked about a single library with millions of documents. What we're going to focus on next when we talk about architecture is a massive distributive archive, right? So we're talking, how do you put 200 terabytes into SharePoint, right? How do you put 1 billion documents into SharePoint? And has anyone out there tried? No? Nobody's tried? So the question is, how do you do that in SharePoint effectively and not get yourself in a bind, right? You don't want to paint yourself into a corner, and you want to make sure that when you are looking at putting millions or hundreds of million documents in SharePoint, that you do it effectively, and you've got the right tools in place, and you're structuring your architecture appropriately. When you're looking at a massive distributed archive, search is going to be key, right? Because your content in these archives no longer lives in one site collection, right? It's distributed across multiple site collections. And so search is going to be key. This concept of drop sites, drop libraries will be key, which leverages things like the content organizer. And then again, the managed metadata service with your taxonomy, your content type syndication is going to be key in having an effective distributed archive in SharePoint. So back-end scale improvements. So we touched on this for a moment. We talked about the We talked about the list throttling on the back end. The SQL team has built something called RBS, and so there's some pieces that we may potentially leverage when we're looking at scaling SharePoint. And there's been a lot done with compound indexing, auto-indexing on the content. Content by query web part is much more performant now. The metadata navigation is much more performant now. So we've done a lot of things on the back end to help you scale out your farms. Okay, so what we're going to do now is jump into that last scenario, right? When we talk about these massive distributive archives and how do you effectively structure your SharePoint farm to handle that. So, oh, that's terrible. Excuse me. All right, so just real quick, I gave them an update, but it didn't land here. So anyways, we'll just speak to the two sides here. So what this is really about is scaling your content databases. So on one end of the spectrum, when we look at our team sites and collaborative sites, we've got content databases, and the threshold there is 200 gigabytes. On the other end of the spectrum, we've got content databases which can be up to a terabyte, right? And those are the limits and boundaries that are set. So if you've done your research on capacity planning in SharePoint, you'll know these are the boundaries. And so the question is, when do we leverage which, and why would this be 200 gigs and that would be a terabyte? And it's really about the workload that you're putting on these databases, right? So in a team site, you're going to have lots of read writes, right? It's going to be I/O intensive. In an archive site, it's going to be less writes and much more reads. So you can almost think of what they call it, write once, read many type scenario in an archive. In an archive. And to get to that point to determine, okay, can I scale to a terabyte or can I scale to 200 gigs, you really have to test that, right? So you need to understand what that workload is and structure your SharePoint farm appropriately so that you're within these guidelines. Okay, so what does this look like? So on one end of the spectrum, we've got our team sites where we can have multiple site collections across multiple content databases. But again, these are going to be read-write intensive, and so we want to keep these databases under that 200 gig limit, right? So there's IOPS requirements around this to keep those databases in that workload scenario, to keep those databases under 200 gigs. Now, how do you actually move that content into the massive distributed SharePoint architecture? And it starts with this master drop site collection. And in that site collection, you'll be leveraging features like the content organizer. You'll have rules associated with that, and you'll have a formal person. It definitely makes sense to dedicate someone to actually maintaining the rules and maintaining the site, so a formal content steward here. From there, it's gonna route the content. So we've got this master drop site. You're maintaining your rules. You're leveraging content routing. It's gonna route that content to the appropriate archive database, right? So this is where we look at having our silos of 1 terabyte databases, which is generally going to be a one-to-one with a site collection. And you have that spread out. And this is when you need to start thinking about information architecture. We'll jump into this in some slides down here. But is it functional, right? Does it make sense to do it by business unit? Does it make sense to do it by year, right? So those are some of the things you need to think about when you're structuring your databases on that end of the spectrum. It's really about what's your information architecture look like there. And across all this, you're going to be leveraging your information policies and the content routing. So does anyone in here actively use information policies? Content types? Okay. So there's a number of different areas where you can apply information policies, right? You can apply it at the content type level. You can apply it at the folder level. But you can build those information policies into that structure, right? And that's really going to allow you to kick something off, stub the record and push it into this drop site, and then organize it appropriately in your SharePoint architecture here on this side of the spectrum. So one of the key things, and we talked about this in the beginning, is to do this effectively, you're going to need a SME, a storage and geometry SME, to help you organize your SAN, right? I mean, how many people in here use SAN for their storage appliance? Okay, so the majority of you. And one of the key things to remember here is that organizing your data files effectively on your SAN is going to help you meet your IOPS requirements. And we'll look at IOPS later in the talk. But in order to, and they vary, right, for content databases. But the key here is separating your data. And I know the font's kind of small here, but partitioning your data files across LUNs. And a lot of times I work with customers and they go to partition this and they say, okay, they're on different LUNs, right? But when you actually lift up the covers and you look, they're on different logical LUNs, right? They're not on separate physical spindles. And what happens is they say, okay, we're getting lots of performance issues. We look closer, we recognize that problem, and they're getting I/O contention, right? They're not getting the throughput they need in order to scale their farms, right? So they're running into these performance problems. So that's the key thing to remember about this slide, is that partitioning these out on separate spindles and also based on proc is going to help lead to better performance and really help you scale your SharePoint farm. And as we go through this and we start looking at FAST as well, FAST is highly dependent on the disk subsystem here as well. So when you look at performance problems in FAST, you look at crawling, things of that nature, a lot of times it comes down to the disk subsystem. So this is definitely an area where you don't want to skimp. You definitely want to put time and effort here. If you do anything when you're building out your architecture, you want to make sure that you're testing out your IOPS and making sure that you're meeting the requirements for your specific workload. And we'll have questions at the end. So if we can take questions now or we can take questions at the end. But the key part of this talk at the end is really a two-way conversation to understand maybe some of the issues that you've run in and trying to do something similar, and also asking questions to get a better understanding of the architecture here. So this is an example of the logical architecture. And again, I apologize. Some of these slides are a little hokey. They didn't get uploaded correctly. But basically what you have is a master drop site here at the top. So that's a site collection. And underneath that, you've got additional site collections that are essentially your archive sites. And that's your structure from the web application down to the site collections and what that would look like. And then that ties into the databases here. And in this particular architecture, we've got RBS as part of this for specific reasons that we'll talk about later when we actually do touch on RBS. The fast index, and your application pool here. So TempDB, I missed this early on, but in the last slide, TempDB is a highly I/O intensive database. And so you want to make sure that you've got the right throughput and you're meeting the IOPS for TempDB, right? And that's a SQL Server thing. So like RAID 10, I mean, if you look at your SAN architecture today, is it RAID 5? Is it RAID 10? Do you have a combination? Do you have different offerings? So a lot of times I run into customers and say, we only do RAID 5, right? And they say, and we have to have that hard conversation that, look, there's certain, if you want to scale this effectively, get the performance that you're looking for, we're going to have to start talking about RAID 10. So something to think about. So this is just kind of an all-up overview of the distributed architecture in SharePoint. But this is how we achieve scale, right? This is how you can get to the point of scaling your SharePoint farms out to terabytes of data. We've got the master hub, which can act as that master drop site. We also, and users are submitting content here, right? And it's running rules, and then you're spreading that out across site collections, across content databases. And that's how you achieve massive scale in SharePoint. The other thing to note is that once you start looking at, terabytes of content, 100 terabytes of content, whatever that may be, you're going to start looking at having more than 1 million documents. And for a user to get real value out of these archives, your records people, your legal people, they're going to want to come in here and say, I need to look up, all contracts or RFPs for this year time frame. You can't do that, right? You've got a site collection thing, so you can't just go ahead and use metadata navigation to do that. The way you're going to have to slice and dice that data is through a search solution, and that being fast, right? Because fast enables us to scale above 100 million documents. And of course, the glue to the entire architecture is having the managed metadata service and the content type syndication, the information policy. So all those tools that we talked about, we said, these are the different scale points in SharePoint, leveraging those tools across the architecture to achieve this. Because if you're not leveraging those tools throughout the life cycle of the document, records, legal, they're not going to be able to get any value out of your solution here. Right, so that's one point that I can't hammer home enough, is that you need to think about your taxonomy. You need to think about taking full advantage of the whole suite of features here to get to this point. Because the reality is your users will not be happy, right? I mean, you're going to say, okay, great, we built this great architecture. We can put, 1 billion documents in here. But if you don't have the right metadata attached, they're never going to see the value in it. And they're going to say, where's our ROI, right? Where did you spend our money? And so has anyone gone through a conversation with their customer where they're having trouble getting them to apply metadata and tagging their content and things of that nature? Okay, so I'll digress for a moment, but a lot of times showing them the benefit through different adoption tactics is really key in helping drive that home. So, and we could talk about that offline, because I've worked with lots of customers but they don't want to put the metadata in, right? So why would we ever do this if they're never going to tag their content appropriately? But it's definitely key to having a successful architecture that scales and that actually provides value to the entire organization. Okay, so what we're going to do now is jump into RBS. Now, RBS is not an essential, necessary component to scaling this, but it's something that you need to think about when you're bringing this together. I noticed a lot of folks in here said that they have a SAN in place. And I don't know about you, but a lot of customers I've worked with, disk stores, the cost of disk can be a pet peeve a lot of times, right? They're like, why are we spending all this money on disk? And so when you approach RBS and you think about, why would I use RBS in my architecture, you really need to approach it from that standpoint. You really want to approach it from the standpoint of, this is going to make everything faster. this is going to make everything more manageable. This is, you want to approach it from, we have a driver to cut down on disk cost, and this is where RBS can come into play. So has anyone in here done anything with RBS? What about EBS? Anybody? A couple folks? How many people in here is their first exposure to RBS and talking about RBS? Okay, excellent. So this will be good because this will provide us a high-level overview. We won't get into the details around this is how you install it and those types of things, but we will provide an overview. So RBS, Remote Blob Storage, is a technology that was introduced in SharePoint 2010. And just to give you some history, in 2007, there was an API built by the SharePoint team called EBS, External Blob Storage. And it was built to tackle a very similar problem that RBS does. But now EBS is essentially deprecated in SharePoint 2010. And so moving forward, you definitely wouldn't look at an EBS solution. You would look towards RBS. And RBS is a technology that was developed by the SQL team, and it's just a standard set of APIs that you can leverage to achieve this remote blob storage. So does everybody know what a blob is in SQL Server? All right, perfect. So if we know that, right, then we can take that, and that's the blob part of remote blob storage. And it's really about taking that var binary, which SharePoint stores its documents as within the SQL database, and extracting that outside of the SQL database, right? And that's kind of like the remote part, right? You've taken this blob and you've pulled it away from the SQL database, and you can put it on a different set of storage. So again, the driver behind this is really about cutting down on disk costs. And I'll say that as we go through this entire talk. But it's, how can we reduce the cost of disk? How can we put these blobs on cheaper storage like NAS or DAS and not continue to contain it within the SQL Server? And this becomes important when we start talking about massive distributive archives, because 250 terabytes of fiber channel is pretty costly, right? I mean, your CIO or manager isn't going to be too happy with spending that much money, and you're saying, well, this is the only way we can scale out SharePoint. And so that's generally where the RBS conversation comes into play. There are some ISVs that have leveraged the APIs that the SQL team has built. So they've created the foundation, the APIs, the platform. And so there are some third-party ISVs that have actually taken that and built their own RBS providers. But what we'll talk about are the RBS providers that we have out of the box, right? So you have a local file stream provider. And in this instance, what you have is, it's not really remote, right? So when you talk about what's the remote part of remote blob storage with a local file stream provider, it's still going against the same SQL Server. The advantage here is that you could partition off your blobs onto a separate spindle, right, and gain some throughput there. So that's the advantage going with the local file stream. Remote file stream. So there's two flavors of this. So one is it's within the same SQL Server, and you're just using a separate database to store your blobs. And then the third flavor is you actually have another instance or a remote instance of SQL Server, and this is where you're storing your blobs. So that's just kind of an overview of the architecture, the provider. You can see there's some, if you can picture these boxes, the outer box as a machine, right? A logical machine, that's your SQL Server, that's your SharePoint machine. And you can see how things are partitioned off. So there's definitely some components that need to be installed on your SharePoint machines and then also within your SQL Server. So that's how it's broken up. And all this is provided through the SQL Server R2 feature pack. I'm not sure if that's in this particular flavor of the deck, but just throwing that out there. So you can download it through the R2 feature pack. Yes. Yep, that's the short, yeah, so the short answer is yes. So there was, I'll jump in this for a moment. So there is the ability, so we discontinued the use of Windows Internal Database, and in 2010, Foundation, you use SQL Server Express, right? And there's a 4 gig limit. And so this was saying to the WSS customers, if you want to move to SharePoint Foundations, and you've got more than 4 gigs of data, which is pretty common. I mean, everyone here has more than 4 gigs of data in their database, right? So this was an option for them, and that's where you see, and that's the local file stream provider, and that's an option in SQL Express. So, so a couple of things out there. So for those of you that have had exposure to RBS, this is really about what are some of the myths or things out there about RBS that may or may not be true, right? And I'll start with don't need a SQL license, right? I just store all my SharePoint data on a file share and connect to it that way, and I don't need SQL Server, right? That's not the case. Another myth is, does it allow me to store those blobs in the cloud, right? And so this really comes down to what have we tested the product for, right? What are the limits and the boundaries when we talk about latency between your SQL Server and your SharePoint servers? And that's 20 milliseconds. So there's nothing in RBS that says you can go above and beyond that. If you go above that 20 millisecond threshold, will you not be supported? Well, that's where, I mean, based on the documentation, you are not supported at that point. But, it's probably recommended at that point if you have a pressing need to go through a supportability review with CSS and understand if you can, breach that limit. But rule of thumb is 20 millisecond latency. That's max between SQL Server and your front ends. Can I just store larger documents in there because of RBS? So the answer is no, right? So there's still a hard 2 gigabyte limit on the size of the file that you can actually store within SharePoint. And RBS does not get around that, right? So it's still 2 gigs. Does it improve the performance? So this is one of those it depends questions. And it's really about your workload. It's really about the size of the files and whether or not it's going to improve your performance. So in some cases, it will slow down your performance. In other cases, it may speed it up. And it's really just a matter of knowing what those different boundaries are. So for instance, anything less than 256K, right, for small files, it's in streaming, it's going to speed up your performance. But for larger files, it may not. So it depends on the workload. At the end of this document, there's actually published information just on this specific topic. So we're not going to dive too deep into it, but I will provide you with the links at the end of this so that you can go find that out. Does it allow me to get around the published limits and boundaries on TechNet? And the answer is no. So this is generally a point of contention. And if we looked at one of the earlier slides, we talked about we had a 2 gig content database here and a 1 terabyte content database here. And the question is, does RBS, because I'm using RBS, the size of the content database shrink, so can I get around that limit? And the answer is no. So when we talk about content database size, it is the metadata plus the blob, and that total size of the corpus that makes up your content database. So when you, you're still going to be having to stay within those published limits and boundaries of 2 gig for normal collaboration workloads and 1 terabyte for archival workloads. Does it mean you don't have to back up the blobs? So the answer is no. You still have to keep your blobs and your metadata in sync, right? So your database backups and your blobs need to be in sync. There's nothing that says you can just back up your database and leave the blobs alone. They have to be backed up together. The other thing here is, part of the reason is that when we do an upgrade or a B2B upgrade, it could potentially touch the blobs, right? So we have full ownership of the SQL Server database, the schema, those blobs as well. And so doing a backup or doing an upgrade, means that we can actually go ahead and touch those blobs. So you've got to keep those in sync. And that should be part of your backup strategy. So when you're looking at, we've got this new fun tool, RBS, you've got to think about your backup strategy. And that leads to this final bullet point on here. Because I've got RBS in place, does it make the overall management of my farm easier? And the reality is, using our providers, what it is, no. The reality is, you've got another SharePoint database that you're going to have to maintain outside the content database. So today, if you store everything in SQL Server, you can think of one content database. If you're using RBS, you now have your blobs externalized on another database. And so for each content database you now have to look at maintaining 2, essentially. And that can increase your operational overhead. And so, and this really goes back to the driver. And when you're looking at, your SharePoint architecture, and you're looking at, well, we really need RBS, you've got to do the cost-benefit analysis to say, does this really make sense? And part of that cost-benefit analysis would say, what are the operational costs for this over the long term, right? So once we're in run state with the solution, what's it going to cost me to operate and support having this RBS in place, right? Does it outweigh the benefits of that capital expenditure, right? So when you went out and, we saved so much money up front because we didn't have to buy a bunch of fiber channel, and now we're offloading our blobs onto, SATA. What's the gain there, right? So there was a short-term gain, but what's the long-term gain, right? So you always have to weigh those costs when you're considering an RBS solution. It's not a silver bullet, but it does have its place, right? It's not essential in doing these massive archives, but it is a tool that you should have ready and available and understand why it's used. And I like to use that saying, with great power comes great responsibility, right? So everyone here in IT, we've got a lot of tools in our tool belt, and we can do a lot of different things. This is another one of those tools, and we just need to think about it cautiously and make sure that we do the best thing for the business, right? So a couple questions, should you use the Microsoft RBS provider? Again, depends on which provider, what your scenario is, but you need to think about why you would use this versus, let's say, an ISV's provider. We're just giving an overview of the providers that Microsoft provides, but there are other providers out there, and you just have to weigh the cost, benefits, features to see what RBS provider makes the most sense for your particular scenario. Software prereqs, so I mentioned this earlier on. R2 feature pack is required, and these are components that need to be installed on your SharePoint servers and your SQL servers. And what about DAS, NAS? Can you use that? And the answer is yes. So in NAS you can use, but you need an iSCSI interface. So it has to look like local storage, right? It can't look like a UNC or something like that. It has to still look like local storage in order to leverage the providers here. So should you select an RBS provider? So again, this goes back to doing that cost-benefit analysis, understanding your workloads, understanding your file types, what makes sense in which scenario. So again, there'll be certain times where certain files you'll gain performance, other files you'll lose performance, like video streaming. So you need to understand which scenarios those make sense and which file types, which workloads, in order to select whether or not you're going to use an RBS solution here. And there's just some examples of unstructured data, a dedicated blob store. We would be looking at enterprise type scenario. We'd be looking at your SANs. Middle of the road, you'd be looking at your NAS, DAS here, and then to the right, again, it's just keeping that in SQL Server. You may come back after looking at RBS as a potential option for your architecture and say, you know what, it just makes sense to keep everything in SQL Server. Limitations and constraints, so local storage, we talked about that. Some of the enterprise features it cannot leverage, so you need to think about that when you're looking at compression, you're looking at transparent data encryption. Some of those the current provider does not leverage. You also, there's a FAQ, an FAQ that I had that talks about what about when you have mirroring and log shipping involved. So this really comes down to your business continuity management plan. And when you're looking at, how do you do disaster recovery, those types of things, do you want to use log shipping? Do you want to use mirroring for high availability? You wouldn't use mirroring for DR over a WAN, but does log shipping make sense? And generally, yes, it's probably going to be part of the solution. But again, I see most of you raised your hands and said you had a SAN solution in place. So a lot of those providers, they have some solution to replicate the LUNs to your disaster recovery centers. But something to be aware of. And again, that comes back to understanding what the operational costs are. How does adding RBS to your SharePoint architecture going to ultimately impact your RTO, your RPO, your SLAs to the customers, and all those other operating costs that come along with it. So we're going to talk about now, and Barry's not in here, so is anyone here interested in fast search? Okay, great. So what we talked about, I'm going to provide an overview of search architecture. If you're very passionate about fast, unfortunately they scheduled us at the same time, but Barry's actually delivering a session just on fast right now. But what I'm going to do is provide a high-level overview of what a fast farm attached to your SharePoint farm would look like for scaling hundreds of millions of documents. So again, fast is required, right, to scale above 100 million documents. So when you look at your limitations and boundaries, you look at SharePoint search, you're under that 100 million item or document limit, right? So that's where fast comes into play. Fast is built, the current version, around physical servers, right? So when you look at, how many of you would you say over half of your data center is currently virtualized? Okay, so I got at least 3/4, so I'm going to go ahead and say it's probably all of you, right? I mean, you're probably, most of your data center is virtualized. And so something you need to consider when we look at the architecture to scale out to hundreds of millions of documents with fast, you need to think about physical versus virtual. I've seen customers virtualize fast. At least certain nodes within a fast farm can be virtualized. But ultimately, this version of the product was really built around physical hardware. So definitely something to take into consideration. Again, finally, disk subsystem. So there was a slide several back. We talked about data storage architecture. I can't stress this enough with fast as well. So a lot of times when we come in, we see performance problems with fast, crawls taking days on end. It really comes down to the disk subsystem, mostly. So definitely something to think about when you're putting together your fast architecture. So I know there's a lot of boxes and there's this big green blob here. But essentially what you have in fast is you have this concept of indexes and you have a concept of rows, or excuse me, columns and rows. And what we're seeing here is, I believe, 14 columns. And this is the index of a 500 million item corpus scaled out across those, partitioned across those 14 columns. And the rows are your failover points, right? So if you ever have to rebuild the index for some reason, you want to have an additional row, right? You don't want just one row. If you only had one row and one column failed, you'd be stuck. I mean, so the rows are the failover mechanism. As far as the SharePoint farm goes, there's query SSAs and content SSAs, very similar to SharePoint search. The content SSAs aren't as stressed here because a lot of the processing that's traditionally done in SharePoint search with the content SSAs is actually offloaded onto your fast farm here. So if you look across this, there's a lot of worker roles within each of these servers. We've got things like docprocs, we've got web analyzer, we've got an admin node. But let me stress, these are all physical machines, okay? So, if you want to build this out on commodity hardware or however you want to build your fast farm out, these are all physical machines. Again, some of these roles can be virtualized, but we've seen some issues around virtualizing a farm of this scale, right? So it's really meant to be a physical build out. Okay, so when you look at fast and you look at the crawl databases, it's structured right now for 50 million items per crawl database. And so if you're looking at 500 million, I think in that farm we've got about 14 crawl databases. So it's definitely something to consider when you're looking at your architecture. Networking. We'll touch on this when we start getting into some of the considerations around scaling your farm. But networking, we've seen, if you don't have really high-speed network, good NICs on these, you can, it's very network-intensive process. When you look at that fast farm and you look at all the nodes, it's very network-intensive. We did have some issues in this setup. And Barry can touch on this more. So if you see Barry, he can give you some more details around some of the issues they had with the hardware when they were scaling out this farm. But just something to be aware of. And again, storage configuration, we can't stress enough. Disk subsystem is key to having a successful fast farm. Because when you're looking at 500 billion documents, you've got to be able to crawl that, right? In order to get value out of that, you've got to be able to crawl it, and not only crawl it, but crawl it in a small enough time frame that it makes sense, right? We can't have our crawls taking weeks. We can't have incrementals overlapping. It's just not. It's not going to be of any value. So we'll talk about some of the considerations. So when we talk about scalability, there's definitely some things to consider, and one of the topics that I've touched on throughout is the disk subsystem, and definitely structuring that appropriately. We talked about SANs. We talked about separating things on physical spindles to really gain the throughput. And so this first consideration is around IOPS. So there's guidance out there published today on what the IOPS requirements are for your content databases. They're different for some of the other content databases, like your SSAs. Your SSAs are very I/O intensive, so you'll be looking at like thousands of IOPS required. Here, what we're looking at is per gigabyte, anywhere between 0.25 IOPS and 2 IOPS. And so, but it really depends on your workload. So we've seen them go even below 0.25 IOPS, and it really comes down to, do you have hot content or cold content? And for really hot content, where it's very I/O intensive, you have large collaboration scenario, you're going to be looking at this higher range of IOPS, right? And this is really coming down to optimizing your disk subsystem. So how do you do that? How do you plan for this? What you want to do is basically take a look at what your workloads are across your SharePoint farm, come up with a test mix that makes sense, set up a rig, and run those workloads against your farm, right? And then capture the data from that, trend on it, and then that will help you determine your requirements. There's a couple of general rules of thumbs you can follow, but that's really what it comes down to. It's going to depend on your workload as to what your IOPS requirements are going to be. A couple tools, you can use SQL.io, SPDiag. Has anyone here used SPDiag or SQL.io, any of these tools? So they're your friends. So this is an example of one of the queries that we run in order to do this. So essentially what we do is we take this query and we run it every couple of minutes, and then we take the deltas between the highlighted columns here. And one of those is actually a table or view. But take this query, and you'll have this deck too, so you can take this query and bring it with you. But basically, just running this every couple minutes, taking the delta, that helps you determine what your IOPS requirements are going to be. Other considerations, property promotion, demotion. This is an interesting one. When you spin up a record center, property promotion, demotion is off by default. So you're going to ask me, well, what is property promotion, demotion? That's basically when you take a document and it's uploaded, and it occurs, there's a couple different events, but let's just take upload. When you upload a document, it's going to read the document properties, it's going to read the metadata, and it's going to marry them up, essentially, right? So it's going to take those and push them in. Now, if you're getting into an archive scenario and you're just submitting content, by the time it gets to that point, it probably has all the metadata it needs on it. And so it can be a really good idea to turn off the promotion demotion. Again, this is off by default in a record center, but let's say you decide to use a document center, you may want to consider if this is necessary. Now, if you do have the requirements to upload some additional metadata, or there's some default metadata on your SharePoint library, then you'll want to keep this on. But it can really help maximize your performance when you're doing large batches of submissions into your SharePoint sites. SQL Server, pre-growing the database files. I've come into, looking at search, right? I mean, I've come into customers and they just, new SQL database instance, what's the, it's like 1 meg or it's a really small amount, right? So, and then they'll say, okay, crawl the farm, right? And they'll go, God, what's going on? And you look and it's like, well, you gotta grow your database, right? I mean, it's gonna be about, depending on the size of your corpus, it could be in the profile of your corpus, it could be 20% of that in your crawl database. So you'll make sure you want to pre-grow that, and you'll see it'll operate effectively. Otherwise, it's just continuing to try to grow, and that's a lot of I/O. It's going to really impact your performance there. Disk subsystem, and this is across the board. I can't stress this enough. We went over this when we talked about fast. SQL Server, same applies. TempDB, very I/O intensive, so you want to make sure that you've optimized that. Document ID service, just something to consider. This service does run at the site collection level. If it's not guaranteed that you will have unique IDs across the entire farm. I haven't seen a lot of collisions there, but the probability is there, and I don't know the exact probability to get those collisions, but it's just something you definitely want to consider. Virtualization. So we talked about virtualizing fast earlier. One of the, we were virtualizing some of the worker roles in the fast farm, some of those nodes, and one of the issues we ran into is this task offloading bit. And so what was happening is we just weren't seeing the throughput, going node to node, and turns out that by default, when a VM's provisioned, there's an optimization switch for the CPU. They turn on this task offloading bit. And this is by default, I believe. Regardless of your hypervisor, I'm pretty sure most of them turn this bit on by default. And so we turned this off, and we disabled it, and we saw much greater throughput between our nodes. So it's definitely something to think about. You definitely want to test for this, whether in your particular situation you need to turn it off, but in our particular testing, we definitely need to turn that off. List throttling. So a couple things around the managed metadata service to be aware of. There is, everyone's aware of the 5,000 item list throttling. This applies to the managed metadata service as well. So if you've got your managed metadata service, you've got more than 5,000 items, that throttling is going to take place. And so it's just something to be cognizant of, right? It's one of those gotchas. You definitely need to be aware of it. And you can't disable it just for the MMS, right? It's one of those settings that's farm-wide. So there's a bunch of information already published out there. I don't have everything in this particular deck, but the deck that I ultimately upload, and I believe you guys have access to all the decks. There's a whole capacity planning resource center up there on TechNet that you definitely want to take advantage of. There's some really good information on there. There's this 30 million item test. Has anybody read this last white paper? All right, so you definitely want to take advantage, print it out. I mean, if you're definitely going down this path of scaling and you really want to scale your SharePoint farms, read this document. It's been a huge help. So in this particular document, we actually test up to 30 million items in one SharePoint library. So it's definitely something that you want to reference, take advantage of, because it's going to show you, it'll give you a test mix. So we talked about IOPS requirements and test mixes. It actually outlays all that. So it looks at the specific workload that they tested against. It shows the configuration of the hardware. So it kind of outlays all these different, what they did in the lab. And there's actually, I think, 2 different sets of workloads that they tested against. So you definitely want to take advantage of that paper because it's got some best practices in there. And it really gives you some good insight if you want to really dig deep into this topic. That's the white paper for you. So definitely take advantage of that. There's a whole bunch of newly published stuff on RBS. I don't have the links to it on this slide, but I do in the other deck that I believe you'll have access to. So you definitely want to take advantage of that. So we've got 15 minutes left, which is right where I want it to be, to have a Q&A discussion and really talk about, maybe some of the pain points that you've had with this or some of your experiences, any questions you may have specifically for me, and reach out to me offline. So, I'm willing to do anything for a 5.0 eval. So please feel free to pick my brain. And hopefully, up to this point, we've definitely met your objectives and expectations. But this is a time where we can really start exploring some of the questions or topics you may have on one of the slides that we saw throughout. So there are microphones. So I would ask that if you have a question, please take advantage of one of the microphones here.
The hardware that you had shown for the fast search there, but there was no specifications on the hardware. You said it was physical, but
Yep.
It matters a lot what we're talking about.
With the physical, with the specs were on the hardware?
Yeah, I mean, how many processors, that type of thing.
I have a slide in here. I believe they were Dells. I want to say they were 8 procs. I've got some slides on this, and it also talks about the disk specs too. So I'll make sure that I include that in that deck. Now that's just an example configuration. It's not the recommended configuration, right? So your mileage will vary across different hardware vendors when you start talking about scaling fast. So I'll make sure to include that specifics.
So you mentioned in your presentation that it's very important to have a strategy for putting metadata with your documents so that you derive value. Yeah. But is it the whole purpose of FAST to kind of crawl and obtain that metadata and not, so you don't have to do it? Or what is the difference there?
Yeah, so there is some value, and one approach I've seen customers take is they say, let's use FAST to crawl our file shares to help us determine the high business value content from the other stuff. And so it's going to extract a certain amount of metadata across your corpus and give you access to that, right? So you can pivot on it and dig into that. What I would say though, and there's also some ability to do what we call custom extractors. So you can actually inject your own, like I believe out of the box they come with one that's company, right? So we'll actually say, it'll look across your corpus. When it crawls, it'll actually extract out company, and then you would have access to that as a refiner in your SharePoint search. FAST is not a solution to not having a corporate taxonomy, right? It's not, but it is a tool that you can leverage to help you kind of sift through your documents. It's going to be better than, let's say, a basic search engine that doesn't have those extractors and refiners and that thing. I mean, you're still going to be able to get some value out of it. But to get to the point where, records are legal, you're in an e-discovery scenario and you're looking for very specific time frames and types of documents, that's going to require a greater level of effort in applying that metadata across your corpus. Now, there are technologies that can help you do that. So for instance, is anybody familiar with file classification infrastructure? Okay, so file classification infrastructure is a file system management tool. But basically allows you to run rules across your content and tag it with some level of metadata. So there's ways to get there. There's other third parties that offer, auto tagging solutions. Some are role-based, some are, smart. And, it is a daunting task, especially let's say you've got 5-10 years of documents piled up and no one's ever applied that metadata, right? How do you get to a point, okay, great, we've got this taxonomy. You're telling me that to scale, I need all the metadata applied. How do I get that point, right? How do you bridge that gap? And I think that's part of what your question is getting towards. And FAST can be a solution. File classification infrastructure can be a solution. But the overarching point is that start today with having that taxonomy in place, right? So that the next 5 years of documents has that metadata applied to it. Thank you.
My company's moving from SAN to NAS.
Okay.
And what I was curious on, and that's for purely financial reasons, just because it's such a huge difference. If IOPS match, do you see any difference in performance?
SAN versus NAS? If the IOPS match, if the throughput's there? No, I mean, I think the main driver would be more around manageability. I think that's what the SAN will buy you above and beyond. You can get throughput on DAS. I mean, NAS. I mean, I've seen throughput work as long as you're hitting those IOPS requirements. The underlying storage is going to be more about, DR, high availability, manageability. You'll start getting those conversations. But as far as the disk subsystem goes, as long as you're hitting those latency marks and the IOPS requirements, then you should be okay.
I'm not familiar with RBS at all. So
Okay.
I'm kind of picking it up as I go, but I've supported file servers for years. So does the entire file system sit in a database? Is that correct? So if you move it to RBS,
Yep.
you have your content database for the 200 gig, and then you have your 1 terabyte for your file system. Does
Yep.
that appear? It sits in a database. Is that correct?
No, so it does sit in the database. The data files are, you essentially have pointers to it, but it has to be part of a SQL instance. But it doesn't sit in the actual tables, right? So the var binary columns that you have in SharePoint that store the blobs, those blobs no longer reside there. They reside outside of that on the file system, we'll say.
So you could
But you have
browse
pointers
to
to it.
like a UNC path. You could actually see the file system.
No, it has to look like local storage. So now,
So it looks like a F drive on a server.
yeah, and you could say, and that's what the remote stream is for, remote provider, is that you've got one main SQL instance that's housing your metadata, your content databases, and then you have another SQL instance that's dedicated just for RBS, right? Just for the blobs. But you still need a SQL instance shell in order to house that, right? I mean, that's the meat of it. But it's not residing in the data. It's in data files on disk.
Okay. So in one of your slides, you had said that you have to point in time backup of the metadata and the file structure.
Yeah.
So that means you're backing up whatever utility you're using. It's backing up a database of metadata and a file structure.
Correct. You've got to keep those in sync, right? Yep. You've got to back those up together.
So there would be an impact in like backups because
There would be.
Terabyte SQL backup. You're now getting anywhere from a meg file all the way up to 2 gigabytes.
Yeah, I mean, you can see some improvements around backup and compression there, but the point is keeping those in sync. So there's no, again, RBS is not a silver bullet to saying, okay, we're going to go all cheap storage and we only need a small amount of, RAID 10 or fiber channel. But it is a tool. You need to understand what it's meant for, what the drivers and the business value of it are, and then work from there.
I have a two-part question.
Yeah.
First is, I'm glad you clarified about the content database size limits because it's not clear out there
Yeah.
that it includes the externalized RBS as well as the content database.
Yeah.
And is another reason for that, for the B2B upgrades, in that it has to still go through the blobs as well as the content DB?
Correct. So when you think about, I mean, the B2B upgrades, we may or may not have to touch the blobs.
Right.
So,
Okay.
but again, we own the whole schema, and that structure, right? The supporting structure, is owned, and we don't publish. This is how you can't touch that, right? So it's got to be. It's logically one unit still, even though it's externalized.
Okay. Second question is, we have used RBS, local file stream provider, and we're at 450 gig right now. Now, it's not your guidelines for the read-write. It's not write once, read many. It's kind of It's just general guidelines?
Well, no, so RBS, I wouldn't say you have to do write once, read many. I was giving that more as a scenario of, you know, in an archive scenario, it's kind of a write once, read many. RBS doesn't have to be used in an archive scenario, so it can be used in other scenarios. It's just that, now the guidelines, they did recently publish some new information on RBS, and I'll make sure that's included in the deck so you can get access to that. I believe it provides some rule of thumb around the read-write, and it provides the guidance around, you know, size of file, performance when using RBS. So that kind of decision tree that we saw, that we brushed over during the RBS overview, is in there. So I think that will help kind of answer your question further. Yep.
Do you know of any third-party backup tools that back up the content databases and the remote blob store in an atomic transaction?
So, okay, so the question was, are there any third-party RBS providers?
No. Third-party backup tools
Oh,
like Commvault or
yep. So I'm not sure off the top of my head. I could give you a list if you want to ping me offline with that one, if that would help. But.
I just would like to clarify one of your earlier slides where you were going from the collaboration production environment to an archiving environment.
Yeah.
Where you had obviously a different physical architecture, but it seems to me that you also need a different logical architecture. And it's not, I mean, I've been to some other sessions where I kind of understood that between the lines. And what I'm wondering is is there any, I don't know, guidelines for going from one to the other when you're about to archive something? Because in my experience of SharePoint, I would not take a site, take a backup and restore it somewhere in the archive because there would be duplicates and versions and a lot of things that I would like to get rid of, especially in the context of rediscovery and archiving. I wouldn't keep the whole thing. So I'm kind of a little fuzzy on that middle tier you had there on your slides on how that happens.
Yeah, and so that just has to be part of your, how that happens is a couple different ways. So one, you can just leverage information policies. So from the inception of the content, it has a particular content type, and you've got a disposition policy on there that says, okay, after 2 years, archive. And then it goes through that process, and then it stubs it. You also have in-place records management, right? So a user can actually go ahead and say, this is a record, stubs it, and it pushes it to that master drop site. So there's a number of different ways. The point there is that the master drop site kind of masks the user from the underlying structure of that distributed architecture, right? So users are never going directly to those site collections. You know, maybe your records person or the content steward might be or something like that. But it's more through a submission process or a policy or something on those lines of how the content actually gets into that underlying structure.
Right. I mean, those are really great features, but I think the problem with that is that they really require a very high maturity of the SharePoint users. To have all your content that goes into SharePoint classified and with information policy on them. I mean, I don't know about people who are out here, but in my context, that is not going to happen for quite a while.
I will talk to you more about this offline. No, because you've got some good points, and I've gone through this. So other content. So there's lots of other great SharePoint content. SharePoint Conference 2011. We hope to see everyone there. We hope to have much more good information around scaling SharePoint. So hopefully everyone can be there. Finally, lots of different resources. And definitely complete your evals. Don't forget to score 5s. And again, I will be here. And you can ask me questions until I get that 5. So Appreciate that. Definitely felt your evals. Thank you very much. Have a great night. Enjoy your beer.